Let's talk about what's happening in the Persian Gulf, because we've very clearly had a demonstration this morning, had anyone doubted it, of the dangers to shipping. 3 cargo vessels struck in short order, one of them currently on fire off the coast of Dubai. The critical pinch point, as we've been telling you throughout, is the Strait of Hormuz, just 21 miles across at its narrowest point, and in normal times around a fifth of the world's daily supply of oil and gas passes through that strait. There is some evidence that ships have been moving in spite of the risk, with transponders turned off, but clearly the latest spate of attacks is going to force a rethink. President Trump has talked about force protection of the convoys, but for how long? And what does that military option look like? With me is Mikey Kay, military analyst for the Security Brief. Welcome.
Hey.
Let's talk about the Iranian threat, first of all. Let's understand that properly before we talk about the response.
Yeah, and I was speaking to a former commander of UK mine countermeasures vessel who operated in the Persian Gulf. And the threat isn't what you think it is in terms of conventional. Okay, so the big conventional threats are ballistic missiles and anti-shipping missiles. The Iranians, for example, have just purchased what's called the CM-302. I think we've got some footage of that. It's a supersonic anti-shipping missile that the Iranians have just purchased from China. They don't have them yet, but they are, potentially a potent threat. But here's the thing, Christian. The Iranians are the masters of what is called asymmetric warfare. Asymmetric warfare, using tactics like sabotage, suicide bombings, hit-and-run attacks, urban warfare. Basically, the objective of asymmetric warfare is to aim to not destroy, but disrupt the enemy, so they can frustrate and outlast the enemy. So that's asymmetric warfare. So what does asymmetric warfare look like in the Straits of Hormuz? Well, the major threat is what is called go-fasts. Go-fast is what the terminology that he used. And they're basically fast attack boats. I think we've got some video footage there. There we go, that's an Iranian fast attack boat. Swarming is the tactic, so lots of them. Fast attack craft. And he even mentioned jet skis being used with the driver, with someone on the back with an RPG, for example. Now, you're not going to sink a vessel with an RPG, but you're going to do some damage to it.
Because it's only 21 miles across, so a vessel as small as that is useful in that context.
Right, and the lanes are actually 3 kilometres wide inside that 21 mile strait. So, yeah, so that's, the go-fasts are really interesting. How do you defend against that? Well, you literally have to put all hands on deck on the surface. And they'll use things like machine guns, but also something called a close-in weapon system. I think we've got some footage of a close-in weapon system. It's basically a Gatling gun with 6 barrels that fires anything between 3,000 to 4,500 rounds a minute. And that can be used, that's out to about 1 to 2 kilometres. But if they're coming with swarms, again, it's really difficult. Now, the other really interesting bit that he spoke about is something that we've heard about going back decades, is mining. And how the Iranians mine the Straits of Hormuz. And this is fascinating because during this time of year when it gets hot, there becomes a humidity layer which reduces the visibility. So when it reduces the visibility, the radar finds it difficult to be able to see what's in the close proximity, right? This is why the fast swarming boats are really, really effective when the visibility is low. When it comes to mining and the visibility is low, you can't eyeball the mines. Now, we're talking about old World War II mines that have the spikes coming out that are basically contact fuses. And what happens in the Gulf of Oman and around the Straits of Hormuz is that when the Iranians put mines in, the currents actually go in a circular motion. So the mine hunters can go and mine hunt a specific area, but the currents are going to bring the mines back in. Exactly. So he basically said it's a strategic game of chess. And the big problem with mines are, if the Iranians say that they have mined a certain area, it's now up to the US or whoever's patrolling to disprove that. And it's not just about mine-laying vessels that the Iranians have. They'll most likely be targeted. We know that Pete Hegseth has spoken about the Navy being one of the objectives. The point here is, coming back to asymmetric warfare, that any Iranian vessel can lay a mine, including a fishing vessel. That's why it's a big problem to target the threat.
So what does force protection look like? I mean, according to rumours from Washington, they've talked about it, but there's not a cohesive plan of how to put it in the Persian Gulf. You often talk about layered defence. Explain to me what you would have to put in place in order to defend the convoys passing through.
Right, and the US does have some vessels that are actually designed for escort. I think we just had a picture up of one earlier. But the numbers, you just have to look at the ratios. I think the US have currently 24 in service. Here we go. And if you look at the amount of vessels, maritime shipping that's going through the Straits of Hormuz on a daily basis, it's 40 to 60 vessels, although that number is down. I think we've got a time lapse just to show how much the shipping has actually decreased and bottlenecking, if you like.
But I mentioned that some of them are turning their transponders off. So there's more ships going through than we think are going through.
Right. That's shipping that is using either what's called going dark, as you say, by turning the transponders off. There we go. That's you can see the bottleneck there on the screen of the lack of shipping that's going through. But what is getting through, as you say, is shipping that's going dark, or it's spoofing. Spoofing means that it's pretending to be someone else, for example, wearing a Chinese name, or example that you see on radar. So that's what is happening in order for those vessels to get through.
And what does that mean for insurance, for Lloyd's of London, who have to insure these vessels?
Absolute nightmare, because the war premiums, which are traditionally at about 0.125 of hull value, are now going up to about 1 to 3%, which is a significant amount to insure a vessel of that size. The other bit is that the insurance companies use all the data that comes from the movement that's tracked on the transponders in order to draw up those premiums. That data is now going. We saw from the time-lapse image. So they're now having to use satellite imagery, synthetic aperture radar, geolocation, to be able to sort of try and drum up these premiums of war premiums for these ships, which is just throwing the whole insurance premium policies off for every vessel that is going into the Persian Gulf.
Ironically, the vessels that are getting through, aside from those that can convince the IRGC they're Chinese, are Iranian vessels, because they're not going to strike their own, and they have a lot of oil that they can move.
Right. And the centerpiece, or the center of gravity, if you like, of Iran's oil export is an island called Karg Island. I think we've got a graphic to show you Karg Island. Karg Island is about 30 miles off the coast of Iran, and effectively it is a oil export facility. So every piece of crude that Iran has, which is either onshore or offshore, is pumped in through Karg Island, and the tankers, like the shadow tankers and the spoofing tankers, will come up and they'll take that oil off and it'll go out to Asia and China. But Karg Island is a critical, it's the center of gravity because it's Iran's critical vulnerability. So if the Americans really wanted to disrupt Iran's oil production, which would obviously spike oil prices, but in the beginning, if they really wanted to do some damage, it wouldn't surprise me if contingency operations were currently being worked up for the US to disrupt or seize that in some way.
Because economically, that is the lifeline for the regime. So if you're trying to force regime change, you have to deprive them of that.
The IRGC, absolutely.
But how difficult would that be?
I mean, again, you know, we saw how Maduro was lifted. I mean, it would likely involve special operations, maybe the Night Stalkers, the 160th. They would be able to get across the Gulf and be able to seize that using that type of capability that we saw that was used in Venezuela. However, I think the big question then is how do they defend it? And actually, what would be Iran's retaliatory response? Because obviously no one's going to want to put kinetic on that. You know, they don't want to blow it up. They want to be able to seize it and use it. We already know that Trump seized Venezuelan oil. There is a trend here which suggests that that would be an unspoken about objective, and that would be the critical capability in order to do that.
The thing that strikes me about all of this and the attacks today in the Gulf is that although Donald Trump talks about 3 weeks, 4 weeks as his timeline, and the Iranians have responded to that by saying, we will decide when this ends, with respect to shipping, there is no hard full stop here, is there? This is going to have to be protected for a long time to come.
Yeah, it goes back to the escort question. When you're looking at the numbers that you've got, in order to restore the maritime traffic in the Persian Gulf to pre-war levels, you're talking about 40 to 60 a day. The US have 24, and obviously it wouldn't just be the US. I'm sure there'd be other countries that would contribute to the escort piece. But you're looking at 2 of those type of vessels that the US have, with maritime shipping in the middle of that as escort through the Straits of Hormuz. And as you say, you know, that's not a 3-week, 4-week problem. That is a problem that exists as long as there's an asymmetric threat from Iran. And we're talking about drones, go-fast attack vessels, those type of threats that are really hard to counter. We've had massive conversations already about the cost-benefit ratio of, a Patriot missile being used to take out a Shahed. That's not going to work long term. And so it's not just about the number of vessels, it's about the type of capability that those vessels have to be able to target those more asymmetric threats that the Iranians can just keep on throwing, depending on obviously how much their capability is being attrited, but it's conventional capability that's being attrited. It's the ballistic missiles, it's the anti-shipping missiles, it's the surface-to-air missile systems. How do you know where someone's going to launch from, somewhere near Bandar Abbas in the Strait of Hormuz on a jet ski or a fast attack boat? And they would have all been decentralized.
Or drop a mine off a fishing boat.
Exactly.
Extraordinary stuff. Yeah, really interesting. Mikey.